Mojtaba Khamenei's own track record on the nuclear question explains why Pickaxe Mountain has become such an urgent flashpoint under his rule. His father had issued a verbal fatwa calling nuclear weapons un-Islamic, a position Iran's government pointed to for years as proof its nuclear program was purely peaceful. Mojtaba has never made any comparable statement. Instead, back in April, he vowed to protect Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities in direct defiance of Trump, saying his country would defend what he called its fundamental and modern technologies. From nano and bio to nuclear and missile, and describing them as national capital, Iran would guard the way it guards its maritime land and air borders, about as close as one can get to publicly disowning his father's fatwa, without formally reversing it. That's exactly the kind of statement that's pushed Western intelligence agencies to treat any activity at Pickaxe Mountain with heightened alarm rather than routine monitoring. The United States and Iran signed an interim memorandum of understanding on June 17th, an agreement that halted major combat operations, called for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and set a 60-day window to negotiate a more lasting resolution. It explicitly states Iran can never build a nuclear weapon, and it spells out terms for handling Iran's existing enriched material stockpile, describing a process of downblending that material on site under direct IAEA oversight. So on paper, there's a signed agreement meant to resolve the very stockpile question at the center of this story, but satellite images showing trucks moving in and out of Pickaxe Mountain paired with Khamenei's own defiant April remarks about guarding nuclear capabilities. As national capitals suggest, what's happening on the ground doesn't match what's written on that page, which is exactly why Trump's threats to hit the site have grown louder, not quieter in the weeks since it was signed. It's also worth noting that even while this diplomatic track has technically stayed active, the military campaign never really stopped. By the time Trump made his most recent, most direct threats about Pickaxe Mountain, U.S. Central Command had already bombed Iranian targets for 11 consecutive nights, hitting military operations centers, drone storage sites, and logistics infrastructure meant to weaken Iran's grip on commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, an active ongoing bombing campaign running alongside a signed diplomatic agreement, which shows just how fragile those terms have really been. Analysts who've studied how Pickaxe Mountain was built point out that it's an extraordinarily deep facility, engineered from the outset, to withstand exactly this kind of air campaign. Not by accident, since the whole complex was built, starting in 2020, specifically to replace the facility Iran lost to fire at Natanz. Even America's most powerful conventional bunker-buster bombs, the same class of weapon that produced what officials called extremely severe damage at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan during last year's, strikes may lack the penetration depth to fully collapse a facility buried this deep in solid rock. That uncertainty is part of why some experts monitoring the site have warned that Trump's threatened big fat shot could look dramatic on television, without delivering the decisive lasting result his rhetoric implies. It's also likely part of why Iran's own military command felt confident enough to publicly warn that a strike would simply widen the war rather than end their nuclear ambitions. They may genuinely believe the facility's core capability would survive, even a direct hit. Gulf states nearest to Iran have their own stake in whether such a strike actually happens. They've spent months absorbing missile and drone spillover, adjusting their security postures and balancing their economic ties to Iran against their security partnerships with Washington. A strike aimed specifically at Iran's nuclear program rather than the conventional military infrastructure that's defined most of this war's. Targeting so far represents a different category of escalation in the eyes of regional governments, because it touches the weapons of mass destruction question that has long been treated as the one line capable of triggering Iran's most severe and unpredictable retaliation. That's part of why Iran's Joint Military Command specifically warned that hitting nuclear or sensitive sites would widen the regional war rather than simply intensify the current. One widening implies pulling in new fronts and new countries beyond those already fighting. The Isfahan stockpile deserves attention on its own, since it may pose an even more urgent risk than Pickaxe Mountain Grossies. Confirmation that roughly 200 kilos of Iran's highly enriched uranium sits in deep tunnels outside Isfahan means there's a second site holding weapons-capable material that any real strategy would have to address. Not just the newer facility, drawing most of the headlines. That's exactly the concern Andrea Stricker, Deputy Director of the Nonproliferation Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, raised in a policy briefing, arguing that before the U.S. and Israel wind down major combat operations against Iran, two urgent tasks remain: neutralizing Pickaxe Mountain itself and separately recovering or eliminating the highly enriched uranium scattered across these sites, so it doesn't fall into the hands of surviving regime elements, other hostile states, or terrorist proxies. That second task, physically securing or destroying the material itself. Not just the buildings around it may actually be the harder and more urgent of the two, since buildings can be rebuilt over years, but weapons-capable material that disappears amid a collapsing or fracturing regime is a much faster-moving danger. Throughout this war, senior Iranian commanders, nuclear scientists, and political leaders have been tracked down and killed with a precision that Iran's own officials have publicly admitted exposes serious vulnerabilities inside their security apparatus, a significant concession that Iran's most protected people were located and hit with an accuracy that shouldn't have been possible if internal security were working as intended. Each successful strike lends credibility to future warnings about Iranian capability or intent because it shows that whatever intelligence network is behind these warnings has repeatedly proven it can find and act on precise, actionable information deep inside supposedly secure Iranian structures. That's the track record behind the warning about a fresh plot to assassinate Trump, an intelligence apparatus that's already shown through the killing of Iran's own supreme leader and numerous senior commanders that its information tends to hold up rather than being speculative. Israeli intelligence reportedly passed along information to the United States indicating Iran had developed a new plan specifically aimed at assassinating President Trump. That reporting came from the Wall Street Journal, citing people familiar with the matter who said Israeli intelligence described the plan as actively in development. Some American officials speaking separately to Israel's. Channel 12 characterized the warning as more general, suggesting it may have partly been intended to smooth relations between Trump and Netanyahu rather than describe a fully operational imminent threat. Regardless of exactly how advanced the plot actually was, the fact that Israeli intelligence flagged it to Washington fits a longer, well-documented pattern of Iran targeting American leadership over the years, and it raises the stakes considerably around any potential American strike on a facility as symbolically and strategically loaded as Pickaxe Mountain. Mossad's credibility on this kind of warning carries real weight, since its record throughout this war has been remarkably precise. Yossi Cohen, Mossad's former director until 2021, gave an interview describing the joint American-Israeli operation against Iran's nuclear program as having obliterated Iran's nuclear sites and halted its uranium enrichment, entirely crediting close, quiet coordination between the Trump administration, Mossad, and the Israeli military. He described operations reaching well beyond fixed nuclear infrastructure, saying Israeli intelligence had also destroyed Iranian air defense systems and Revolutionary Guard sites, and had tracked down Iranian operatives inside their own homes in Tehran. And elsewhere, he issued a direct warning to Iran that Israel can come again if it tries to resume its nuclear program. A former Mossad chief who worked with 3 American presidents, publicly confirming both the scale of what's already been destroyed and the credible threat facing any Iranian rebuilding effort, which is exactly the backdrop against which those satellite images of trucks at Pickaxe Mountain should be read. There's also a broader story of intelligence penetration that Iran's own foreign minister has recently acknowledged in striking terms. Abbas Araghchi suggested publicly that foreign intelligence penetration of Iran now goes beyond simply locating officials or stealing information and appears to be actively working to influence decision-making inside the Islamic Republic itself, an extraordinary admission from a sitting Iranian foreign minister, essentially conceding that outside intelligence services, almost certainly Mossad and the CIA, may have burrowed deep enough into Iran's internal structures to shape actual leadership choices, not just gather information about them. Iranian officials have long acknowledged espionage and intelligence breaches, especially given how precisely senior commanders, scientists, and political leaders have been found and targeted throughout this war. But acknowledging that outside intelligence might be shaping Iran's internal decisions is a different, more alarming admission, one tied directly to lingering questions about how Mojtaba Khamenei himself came to be installed as supreme leader. Former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad appeared on Iranian state television the day after reports surfaced that he had once met with a Mossad chief, and according to those reports, had been considered for installation as Iran's leader instead of Mojtaba. Consider the layers packed into that one detail reports of Israeli intelligence in direct contact with a former Iranian president about potentially installing him as a replacement leader, followed by Ahmadinejad's public appearance, the very next day presumably meant to counter or address those very reports. Whether that plan was ever seriously pursued, or is just one thread among many competing intelligence operations, swirling around Iran's fractured post-assassination leadership, its mere presence in the public record, shows how deep and contested the power struggle inside Tehran has become since Khamenei's death in February. Here is a way to picture what's unfolding across these 2 intertwined threads, 2 chess games being played at once on boards secretly connected underneath the table. On one board sits the visible physical contest, a fortified mountain facility. Iran keeps quietly reinforcing while publicly insisting it's honoring a nuclear agreement facing off against an American president who has named the exact target and described the exact kind of strike he's weighing. On the other board sits the shadow contest intelligence services on both sides working to locate, track, and in some cases eliminate the decision makers who actually control what happens on the visible board, with assassination plot warnings flowing one way and reports of former leaders being courted as replacements flowing the other. Neither board fully makes sense without the other, whoever wins. The shadow contest effectively decides what happens at the mountain, and whatever happens at the mountain raises the stakes and the personal urgency of the shadow contest for everyone involved. The Ahmadinejad detail is worth lingering on. A former sitting president carrying decades of name recognition and complicated standing at home and abroad, reportedly meeting with a Mossad chief and being weighed as a potential replacement leader, points to an extraordinary degree of contingency. Planning on Israel's part, suggesting Israeli intelligence wasn't focused solely on removing Khamenei, but was actively considering and possibly cultivating alternative leadership options before or right after that assassination took place. Ahmadinejad's television appearance the next day only deepens the uncertainty. It's genuinely unclear whether it reflects him distancing himself from the reports, the regime using him to project unity despite internal cracks, or something else not yet fully reported. Whatever the full story turns out to be, its presence in the public record shows the succession question inside Iran has never been as settled as Mojtaba Khamenei's public defiance toward Trump might suggest. A story this significant, a named nuclear target, a sitting president's direct threat, a warned assassination plot, doesn't stay confined to security and intelligence circles. Every time it resurfaces with new satellite imagery or a fresh presidential statement, energy markets and regional currencies tend to react within hours pricing in the heightened risk of the kind of dramatic escalation a strike on Pickaxe Mountain would represent. That reaction isn't irrational. A strike aimed specifically at Iran's nuclear program, especially one that risks widening the war, exactly as Iran's military command has warned, carries a fundamentally different risk profile than the more conventional exchanges that have defined most of this war's headlines, and traders understand that distinction clearly. It's worth being honest about what remains genuinely uncertain here, rather than overstating what's confirmed. Nobody outside a small circle of intelligence officials knows for sure how advanced the plot against Trump actually was, with some American officials describing the Israeli warning as more general than an imminent, fully operational threat. Nobody knows for certain what those trucks moving in and out of Pickaxe Mountain are actually carrying: genuine reconstitution of enrichment, capability, routine, construction, and reinforcement, or some mix of both. And even experts who've tracked the facility for years caution that its extreme depth may put it beyond the reach of even America's most powerful bunker busters, meaning Trump's threatened big fat shot might not deliver the decisive outcome the rhetoric suggests. However satisfying that kind of strike might sound in a press conference. Stepping back, the bigger picture looks like this. A nuclear facility that has survived this entire war untouched is now showing fresh satellite evidence of active reinforcement and vehicle movement sitting beneath a signed diplomatic agreement meant to resolve exactly this kind of activity through inspection and downblending rather than confrontation. A sitting American president has named that facility directly and described the kind of strike he's weighing, while Iran's military command has explicitly warned that hitting it would widen the entire regional war. A new supreme leader has never disavowed his own father's religious ruling against nuclear weapons, yet has publicly vowed to protect Iran's nuclear capabilities as national treasure in direct defiance of Trump. And running beneath all of it, Mossad is warning Washington about a fresh assassination plot against the president, even as Iran's own foreign minister publicly acknowledges that outside intelligence services may be shaping decisions at the very top of his government. Each of those threads alone would be major news in almost any other context. Watching them converge simultaneously around one mountain and one presidential threat is what makes this moment worth close attention. 441 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60, confirmed by the IAEA, as of last year, sits somewhere within a network that includes both the Isfahan facility, Grossi specifically named, and whatever remains reachable at Pickaxe Mountain. Getting from 60 enrichment to the roughly 90 purity needed for an actual weapon is a real technical step, but a smaller one than the step that got Iran to 60 in the first place. Exactly why every Western intelligence agency treats that stockpile as such an urgent proliferation risk, no matter how deeply it's currently buried. If a strike on Pickaxe Mountain genuinely destroyed or permanently sealed off access to that material, it would mark a major, possibly decisive blow to Iran's remaining nuclear ambitions.